Hey, welcome back to the virtual sponsorship series. This is a study of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Today's video will be on the first half of Chapter 4, We Agnostics. If you want to check out some of the earlier chapters, click on the link that will bring you to the playlists containing all of the virtual sponsorship series. In the preceding chapters, you have learned something of alcoholism. We hope we have made clear the distinction between the alcoholic and the non-alcoholic. If, when you honestly want to, you find you cannot quit entirely, or if when drinking you have little control over the amount you take, you are probably alcoholic. If that be the case, you may be suffering from an illness which only a spiritual experience can conquer. So this paragraph about sums up everything that we've been talking about in the previous chapters. If you can't control your drinking, if you start drinking and cannot stop, and when you try to quit you cannot stay stopped for very long, then you are probably alcoholic. And we have already established that if you are alcoholic, then you will not be able to maintain any form of sobriety through human aid. And thus you must seek out a spiritual experience. And so the rest of this chapter is really going to be talking about how we go about starting this journey and seeking out a spiritual experience. To one who feels he is an atheist or agnostic, such an experience seems impossible. But to continue as he is means disaster, especially if he is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. To be doomed to an alcoholic death or to live on a spiritual basis are not always easy alternatives to face. But it isn't so difficult. About half our original fellowship were of exactly that type. At first, some of us tried to avoid the issue, hoping against hope we were not true alcoholics. But after a while we had to face the fact that we must find a spiritual basis of life. Or else. Perhaps it is going to be that way with you. But cheer up. Something like half of us thought we were atheists or agnostics. Our experience shows that you need not be disconcerted. So first and foremost, it says to be doomed to an alcoholic death or live on a spiritual basis are not always all easy alternatives to face. That's a pretty bold statement, but if you are alcoholic, that statement will make perfect sense to you. Now, if we were proposed this alternative in any other form, in any other area of our life, we probably wouldn't think it's so difficult of a choice. Like if we came down with some sort of disease and he said, you know, if you don't take this particular prescription medication, then you're going to die a horrible death. Most of us probably wouldn't have that much of an issue with taking the medication. But when it comes to our drinking and it comes to alcoholism and the spiritual experience, then most of us have a trouble with that. But then it goes on to say that that's not that concerning, because even if you are atheistic and agnostic, and even if you do find these alternatives a hard decision to make, that's completely normal. And then they say half of their original fellowship was exactly of that mind state. So the Big Book was written by Bill Wilson with the combined effort of the first 100 members of Alcoholics Anonymous. They were all involved in the writing and the editing process. And so it was a consensus of like what went in and what didn't, what was taken out, and how the wording was put down on paper. And so when the original fellowship was writing the book, you have to realize 50 out of 100 of them were atheists or agnostic when they were approached by other members of Alcoholics Anonymous and got sober. And so this book was literally written by people who were closed-minded to spiritual concepts. And so they really hold your hand and guide you through the process of how they were able to open up their mind and accept this spiritual solution. And they do a really good job at spoon feeding you very small doses of it, and they're not just unloading it on you all at once so you become overwhelmed and just give up. If a mere code of morals or a better philosophy of life were sufficient to overcome alcoholism, many of us would have recovered long ago. But we found that such codes and philosophies did not save us, no matter how much we tried. We could wish to be moral, we could wish to be philosophically comforted. In fact, we could will these things with all our might, but the needed power wasn't there. Our human resources, as marshaled by the will, were not sufficient. They failed utterly. So in the normal course of experimentation, as we attempt to get sober, we start to check things off the list. And so early on, we just figured that if we wanted to be sober, we could. And then once we finally get to a position where our drinking and drugging is causing enough harm where we want to be sober, that's when we finally attempt to stop. And when we fall short of that, we start to realize that maybe it's a little bit more difficult than we initially thought it was going to be. And so as you struggle to stop, eventually you will come into contact with either treatment or AA or something, if you're lucky, and they'll lay out the spiritual solution that lies within the 12 steps. Now, you learn a little bit about the disease of alcoholism and you learn a little bit about the spiritual solution, but if you're still really closed-minded to it, you might think to yourself, well, I'll just find the easier, softer way, right? So I'm not going to fully accept a spiritual solution to my alcoholism, but I'll just do the right thing. That's basically what they mean by this. And although you might fare a little bit better living that way, in my experience, because I've definitely tried this, it never really works long term. I might do okay for a little bit, but eventually life starts to stress you out, and life is so complex. There's so many issues that crop up, and the right and the wrong thing it's not so black and white. There's so many shades of gray that you can easily lose track of like how to act in the day-to-day. And so without a deeper dive into this spiritual solution, usually you end up back drinking and drugging before too long. Lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves, obviously. But where and how were we to find this power? Well, that's exactly what this book is about. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself which will solve your problem. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral. And it means, of course, that we are going to talk about God. Here difficulty arises with agnostics. Many times we talk to a new man and watch his hope rise as we discuss his alcoholic problems and explain our fellowship. But his face falls when we speak of spiritual matters, especially when we mention God. For we have reopened a subject which our man thought he had neatly evaded or entirely ignored. So if you fully accept your alcoholism, you are accepting the notion that the power does not exist within you to abstain from drinking. To draw a parallel here, if there was a very heavy stone, let's say, that weighed thousands of pounds, you would very quickly realize that the power to lift this stone does not exist within you. And so if you really needed to lift this stone, you would look for a power outside of yourself, i.e. like a heavy machinery, and then you could lift the stone using a power outside of yourself. So this is the same concept that we're using for alcoholism here. It's the power, it does not exist within us, and so we must find the power outside of ourselves. Now, most of us do this within the fellowship of AA, because a group of people is obviously a power greater than the power of an individual person. But most of the time, people who find this power within a fellowship, eventually, as life goes on and life gets better, they start to realize that there is a power even greater than that behind it all. Another way to put this would be, I didn't know how to turn my will and my life over to a power of a God or a higher power, but it was much easier for me to turn my will and my life over to a sponsor, right? And what I mean by that is like I could start to take advice and start to take suggestions from a sponsor. And then it wasn't until much later on down the road that I realized that God was working through my sponsor to save my life. But the God word does cause an issue with some people, and people definitely are prejudiced to the idea. Not everybody, but a lot of the people that end up in AA have this experience, and you hear it all the time in meetings. Now, when these say God, they don't mean a God of a specific religion, and I think that's where most people's issues crop up, because they have a bad taste in their mouth against some sort of organized religion, or perhaps organized religion as a whole. And so when they hear God, they automatically think of some sort of official church, and that causes them to kind of close their mind and think to themselves that they'd rather not have anything to do with this. But when they say God, they're talking about a God personal to you. I've also heard people say the only reason why they say God is because it's the easiest word, because saying something along the lines of a power that they can neither define nor understand, that they experienced as a result of working the 12 steps, that's just too much, to say in conversation and in sharing and stuff like that. So God is just the shortened version of that. It's just a power in which we can neither define nor understand, that comes over us as a result of living by spiritual principles and working the 12 steps. We know how he feels. We have shared his honest doubt and prejudice. Some of us have been violently anti-religious. To others, the word God brought up a particular idea of him with which someone had tried to impress them during childhood. Perhaps we rejected this particular conception because it seemed inadequate. With that rejection, we imagined we had abandoned the God idea entirely. We were bothered with the thought that faith and dependence upon a power beyond ourselves was somewhat weak, even cowardly. We look upon the world of warring individuals, warring theological systems, and inexplicable calamity with deep skepticism. We look askance at many individuals who claim to be godly. How could a supreme being have anything to do with it all? And who could comprehend a supreme being anyhow? Yet in other moments, we found ourselves thinking, when enchanted by a starlit night, who then made all this? There was a feeling of awe and wonder, but it was fleeting and soon lost. I don't know about anybody else, but I kind of feel like they're talking to me here, or at least the past version of myself. I definitely thought that faith was fine for some people, but I just didn't think I needed anything to do with it. I thought that I was smarter and stronger than that, and that faith was basically for weak-minded people. But the thing is, that's a pretty insane thought considering the state of my life. Here I am thinking that I'm superior to the average person of faith. Meanwhile, I'm living in squalor, and I have nothing to show for it. But yes, these prejudices that they're talking about, the religious wars that have plagued mankind over the centuries, and the self-righteousness, the hypocritical Christian, for example, are things that I used as a way to prove the non-existence of God. Right? Because if God was real, then why would this terrible stuff happen in his name? And then the end of the paragraph with the classic agnostic conundrum here. We look at the world and all its evil, and think, how could there be a God behind this? But then we're enchanted by the starlit night, and it makes us wonder, where did we come from? Why are we here? Those existential questions. And so, an atheist believes that there's proof that God doesn't exist. An agnostic believes that there is no proof that God exists, and there's no proof that he doesn't exist. And so they kind of straddle the fence, and they just sort of wonder, but they don't really end up going one way or the other. Much to our relief, we discovered we did not need to consider another's conception of God. Our own conception, however inadequate, was sufficient to make the approach and to effect a contact with him. As soon as we admitted the possible existence of a creative intelligence, a spirit of the universe underlying the totality of things, we begin to be possessed of a new sense of power and direction, provided we took other simple steps. We found that God does not make too hard terms with those who seek Him. To us, the realm of spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding. To those who earnestly seek, it is open, we believe, to all men. So here, obviously, they're saying, you don't have to become a member of an organized religion. You don't have to accept any sort of established church's view on what God may or may not be. But further than that, you don't have to accept anybody else's conception of God. And that even means like other people in AA. I imagine that if I were to sit down with my sponsor and have a conversation about what we think God is like, we probably would agree on a lot of things, but there might be some areas in which we don't necessarily see eye to eye, and that's completely fine. Because there isn't one idea of God that works that's better than another idea. The point they're making here is, to begin this journey, we just have to open our minds to the idea that this could be a real thing. And if we can open our mind that maybe there is a creator, maybe there is a power which underlies everything that gives life meaning, then we're well on our way. And so this is a very broad definition here that allows many people to make this start, which is a good thing, because if it were narrower and you had to accept a very specific type of God, then so many people would never begin the journey to begin with. When therefore we speak to you of God, we mean your own conception of God. This applies too to other spiritual expressions which you find in this book. Do not let any prejudice you may have against spiritual terms deter you from honestly asking yourself what they mean to you. At the start, this was all we needed to commence spiritual growth, to effect our first conscious relation with God as we understood Him. Afterward, we found ourselves accepting many things which then seemed entirely out of reach. That was growth. But if we wished to grow, we had to begin somewhere. So we used our own conception, however limited it was. So my first experience with this was prayer. Now, you hear this a lot in meetings. Prayer is always being thrown around as a suggestion in AA. And now, not having much of a spiritual faith at all coming into AA, I had never really had much of a prayer life. Now, in my previous unsuccessful attempts to get sober in AA, I had never taken the suggestion to try prayer, because I didn't believe in God, so why would I just talk to nothing? But when I finally opened my mind a little bit and stopped trying to fight the process, I was suggested to me to do prayer, not because I thought it would do anything, not because I thought it would work, but just because they asked me if I would please give it a try. And so I rationalized it in my logical mind, and I said, well, I could see how maybe it would be beneficial, because you're sort of like, repeating almost like a mantra to yourself every day. If you pray for sobriety, for example, and you wake up in the morning and you pray and you say, God, please help me stay sober today. It's like a mantra that you're repeating. So it just you're just sort of burning it into your subconscious. I did not think I was praying to any kind of power greater than myself, but to make my start, like they're saying, all I had to do was open my mind and take the suggestion. And so I did, and that was what began this conscious contact, because down the line, my life changed drastically, but we'll get to that later. We needed to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe, or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. It has been repeatedly proven among us that upon this simple cornerstone a wonderfully effective spiritual structure can be built. So this is the greatest news, I think, so far. you do not need to have faith to start your 12-step journey and get sobriety, right? You only need to be willing to believe. So belief and faith are the results of the 12 steps. That's the payout at the end of the road. The price of admission is just a little bit of willingness. If you are willing to make an attempt and take the suggestions, then you are well on your way. That was great news to us, for we had assumed we could not make use of spiritual principles unless we accepted many things on faith which seemed difficult to believe. When people presented us with spiritual approaches, how frequently did we all say, "I wish I had what that man has. I'm sure it would work if I could only believe as he believes, but I cannot accept as surely true the many articles of faith which are so plain to him." So it was comforting to learn that we could commence at a simpler level. So the best analogy that I've heard for this conception is if you were to move to a new town and you didn't really know much about it and your car broke down, you would be hard-pressed to figure out what to do. So if you asked an acquaintance where the best mechanic was that you could go to get your car fixed, he would give you a suggestion. Now, if you were willing to believe this person, right, you would act on that suggestion, right? So first comes belief. You believe this person when they say this is the best mechanic in town, and then action follows that. You take the car down to the mechanic, right? Then the mechanic fixes your car quick and cheap and does a great job, right? So you get the results. And then after you've gotten the results that you needed, now you have faith in that mechanic. Next time your car breaks down, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to bring it right to that mechanic. And so it's the same in the 12 steps. Your sponsor says if you want to overcome your drinking, do the 12 steps. If you believe him, then you will take action by doing the 12 steps. Once you have done them and you get the results, peace of mind, freedom, sobriety, all of that. Once you receive those results, now you have faith. And anytime you have a problem that crops up in your life, you're going to take it to your sponsor. You're going to apply the program in your life real time and figure out how it is that we can overcome whatever tribulations that we're dealing with. Besides a seeming inability to accept much on faith, we often found ourselves handicapped by obstinacy, sensitiveness, and unreasoning prejudice. Many of us have been so touchy that even casual reference to spiritual things made us bristle with antagonism. This sort of thinking had to be abandoned. Though some of us resisted, we found no great difficulty in casting aside such feelings. Faced with alcoholic destruction, we soon became as open-minded on spiritual matters as we had tried to be on other questions. In this respect, alcohol was a great persuader. It finally beat us into a state of reasonableness. Sometimes this was a tedious process. We hope no one else will be prejudiced for as long as some of us were. So, I think part of the reason why we lash out in the beginning when people talk of God and spiritual matters, like it makes us angry, is because if God is real, then we feel at the time, because we haven't really done a fourth step yet, we haven't really picked apart our part of things, but we feel that if God is real, then he's to blame for our life being so terrible. Another thing I like to point out around this point in the chapter is I noticed when I had first got sober, one of the fallacies of my logic from before, and that was I always kind of had a resentment against life. A matter of fact, I think I put life on my fourth step list for the resentments. You know, I thought life was unfair and that I had been dealt a bad hand, and so I was very resentful at existing to begin with. And what I realized was that belief is flawed if you don't think God is real, because to be angry at life and feel that life has dealt you a bad hand suggests that there is an intelligence behind life to begin with. If somebody were to throw a rock at you, would you get angry with the rock, or would you get angry at the person who threw it at you, right? Of course you wouldn't get angry at the rock. The rock is an inanimate object. But the person who threw it at you, they're the one who's really to blame. So if you find yourself hating on life, it's pretty crazy that we could actually resent God without even believing in him. The reader may still ask why he should believe in a power greater than himself. We think there are good reasons. Let us have a look at some of them. The practical individual of today is a stickler for facts and results. Nevertheless, the 20th century readily accepts theories of all kinds, provided they are firmly grounded in fact. We have numerous theories, for example, about electricity. Everybody believes them without a murmur of doubt. Why this ready acceptance? Simply because it is impossible to explain what we see, feel, direct, and use without a reasonable assumption as a starting point? So if the impending threat of slow death by alcohol isn't enough to get you to accept faith, we're going to make a few more points here. First being that we have faith in things that we don't understand all the time in the normal day-to-day life. So this idea of accepting a faith in God, which we have no idea about, isn't so foreign as we might think it is. And the example to use here is electricity. Now, I'm not an electrician personally, so I don't know the science behind electricity to the extent an electrician would. And I couldn't wire a house, and if something breaks electrically speaking, I probably wouldn't be able to fix it. And so I don't really fully understand the power of electricity. However, I believe that it's real, and more importantly, I use it. I don't have to understand how electricity works in order to be able to use it, because I know that when I walk into a dark room, if I flip a switch, the light comes on and I can see better. And so it's the same with God. I don't understand even today how God works, right? Because God is beyond human comprehension. But I understand that if I use faith in my day-to-day life, it makes things easier for me. Everybody nowadays believes in scores of assumptions for which there is good evidence but no perfect visual proof. And does not science demonstrate that visual proof is the weakest proof? It is being constantly revealed as mankind studies the material world that outward appearances are not inward reality at all. To illustrate, the prosaic steel girder is a mass of electrons whirling around each other at incredible speed. These tiny bodies are governed by precise laws, and these laws hold true throughout the material world. Science tells us so. We have no reason to doubt it. When, however, the perfectly logical assumption is suggested that underneath the material world and life as we see it, there is an all-powerful guiding creative intelligence. Right there, our perverse streak comes to the surface, and we laboriously set out to convince ourselves it isn't so. We read wordy books and indulge in windy arguments, thinking we believe this universe needs no God to explain it. Were our contentions true, it would follow that life originated out of nothing, means nothing, and proceeds nowhere. Well, that's a pretty depressing view on life, if you want my opinion on it. But the point they're making here is we are able to accept all types of crazy scientific theory, even in light of the fact that scientific theories are constantly being disproved and changed around. That is the nature of science. When somebody creates a scientific theory, all the other scientists set out to disprove it. And so we accept many of these scientific notions on faith that they're real, even though we cannot see it. And he uses the example of the electrons and in the atomic structure of things. I always like to make a point here about science in general. I like to ask my sponsees, for example, whether they believe in science or not, and most of them will tell me yeah. And And so I encourage them to look at the 12 steps in this pursuit of a spiritual experience in a scientific way. And the scientific method says that you form a hypothesis and then you conduct an experiment and record the results. And so if you come into AA and you hear all these people giving you this evidence that they did this stuff and it worked, if you just discount what they're saying and don't look into it at all, that is very unscientific. So I always challenge them. I'm like, form a hypothesis and conduct your experiment, you know? And the beauty of the 12 steps is your hypothesis could literally be that everybody in AA is wrong and that the 12 steps don't work. That could be your hypothesis. But unless you actually do the 12 steps thoroughly, you will never know if that hypothesis holds up to experimentation, you know? And once you've concluded the results, you know, it's my guess is that you're going to realize that all these people knew what they were talking about and they weren't just pulling your leg. Instead of regarding ourselves as intelligent agents, spearheads of God's ever-advancing creation, we agnostics and atheists chose to believe that our human intelligence was the last word, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and end of it all. Rather vain of us, wasn't it? Now, I have met a few people that think that way, but most of the time, people hearing that don't think that they believe that. But if you were really to kind of dissect your actions and the way that you've viewed the world and the way that you've carried yourself thus far, I think most of us would find that we have acted as if this belief was true, at least at one point or another. We who have traveled this dubious path beg you to lay aside prejudice, even against organized religion. We have learned that whatever the human frailties of various faiths may be, those faiths have given purpose and direction to millions. People of faith have a logical idea of what life is all about. Actually, we used to have no reasonable conception whatever. We used to amuse ourselves by cynically dissecting spiritual beliefs and practices when we might have observed that many spiritually minded persons of all races, colors, and creeds were demonstrating a degree of stability, happiness, and usefulness which we should have sought ourselves. So this really hits home for me. I think they're kind of getting to the core of their argument here. It's really easy to sit there and stand in judgment of other people's faith and pick apart all the little nuances of their faiths that doesn't make sense to you. Meanwhile, you know, our life is on fire and we're falling apart inside and out. And so, you know, you have to ask yourself, you know, these people seem to be doing just fine in life and we are suffering almost constantly. And so who has it right and who has it wrong, really? You know, if we take a hard look at that, it might not be easy, but this is kind of what they're asking us to do here. Instead, we looked at the human defects of these people and sometimes use their shortcomings as a basis of wholesale condemnation. We talked of intolerance while we were intolerant ourselves. We missed the reality and the beauty of the forest because we were diverted by the ugliness of some of its trees. We never gave the spiritual side of life a fair hearing. So, this paragraph in particular hit me the hardest. This is my favorite paragraph in this chapter. The very first time I read it, I felt like I had got punched in the gut, and I realized for the first time how much of a hypocrite I had been. One of my main arguments that I would have told anybody willing to listen about my problem with organized religion and God and faith as a whole is the fact that they are so intolerant and that they hate anybody that doesn't believe the way they believe, and they're small-minded and blah, 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 blah. Meanwhile, I'm looking at them standing in judgment and picking them apart. One of my biggest pet peeves was hypocritical people, and in that moment I realized that I was what I despised. I was a hypocrite. So that'll do it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And join me next week for the second half of We Agnostics. If you guys enjoyed this video and you want to keep in the loop with the upcoming Big Book study and other literature that I will be putting out shortly, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, take care of yourself. God bless.